Good afternoon and welcome to the GMaP Region 4 webinar on implementation science. Hi, I'm Linda Fleischer, co-director of Region 4 GMaP office. And for many of you, you may know already about GMaP and have come to our webinar today. And for some of you, you may be learning about GMaP for the first time. And so we'd like to give you a little bit of information about GMaP before we launch into our webinar. So as you can see here, we have 6 regions throughout the country, and the GMaP program, which started in 2009, is an NCI strategy to build regional networks of health disparities researchers, both those who are interested in disparities and also those who are underrepresented scholars, with the idea of really building strong infrastructures and supporting the career development of those investigators. The Region 4 office is located at Fox Chase Cancer Center, and we serve the 13 states that you see circled here in purple. And we're so delighted because we now have more than 800 members that are part of our regional network here. And for those of you who are from other states outside of our region, you can connect with your GMaP office by going to the NCI Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities website and connect right there and find out who is your coordinating office and get more connected. For us here in Region 4, we have a really great team. Myself, as well as Dr. Susan Fisher, we are the co-directors for the program and for the office. And Carrie Norbeck, who many of you do know who are part of our region, because she really is kind of the heart and soul connecting to many of the scholars throughout the region. And for those who would like to know more about GMaP and some of our services, Carrie is a great person to connect with. And as well as Cassidy Kent, our research coordinator helping on many of the projects and services of our program. So what do those services look like? They may vary a little bit among each of the regional offices, but basically we're really here to support the career development of those early stage investigators. We have travel awards, expert grant reviews, and pilot awards in addition to educational programs like today. It's important to check with each of your GMaP offices to find out more detail about when these services are offered and what kinds of requirements there are, but each of us are providing these kinds of support to scholars. The other piece of the work that we do is this whole area of communications. So each office has their own website with all kinds of information about the region, sharing information, sharing resources, as well as an e-blast that goes out periodically, typically about bi-weekly, with all kinds of information about new grant opportunities and training opportunities. So again, this is a wonderful resource for all of you to come to frequently, sign up for these e-blasts and become a member of your regional GMaP office. So why are we doing this webinar today on implementation science? One of the things that we periodically do is survey our members to find out more about their needs, maybe areas of interest. And last fall, we were asking a little bit more about some of these emerging areas of science: commercialization, implementation science, health and digital health, precision medicine. And as you can see here, implementation science really was a big interest for our members. And so we wanted to also find out, well, where might those who are interested be in their stage of development? And again, as you can see, many were beginning to develop proposals or submitting proposals somewhat early in that process. And so we decided this would be a great focus for a webinar. And we are really delighted with our panel today. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Gila Neta, who's the program officer from the National Cancer Institute, Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences, the implementation science team. Dr. Neta is very involved in many of the training programs of NCI in terms of implementation science and working with the implementation science centers around the country. And I think we'll be able to give you some sense of how NCI sees implementation science and some of the funding opportunities available. Dr. Rachel Shelton is the Associate Professor at Columbia University, Mailman School of Public Health. And again, Rachel is going to share with us her career path in implementation science, you know, how she started, some of the training, and where she is in her research as her career has really developed in this area of implementation science. And finally, Dr. Shawna Hudson is a professor and research division chief, Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. We'll talk a bit about from the perspective of a reviewer. Shawna has been on the study section for implementation science, has reviewed many applications, and I think will share with us some of her thoughts about, from a reviewer's perspective, the kinds of things we should be thinking about and the kinds of opportunities and options we have as we think about funding research in this area. In addition, Shawna has been part of our steering committee since the inception of GMaP here in Region 4, and so we're delighted to have her participating in our panel today. So with this really esteemed panel, I think you're going to learn a lot today, and we'll turn things over to Dr. Gila Neta.
Thanks so much, Linda. And I appreciate you doing that poll in advance of the talk. So I think for the 57% or so who said they're new to this material should all hopefully be informative to you. For the 20-something% who have attended a training in the past, I think some of this material will look familiar if you've heard either Russ Glasgow or David Chambers or Wynne Norton or myself or others give an introductory talk. So this is an orientation implementation science from a National Cancer Institute perspective or a National Institutes of Health perspective. I'll also be, in addition to giving that orientation to the field, talking a little bit about a funding opportunity that we offer across the NIH, as well as some additional opportunities for learning and resources. I know Rachel and Shawna will be delving deeper into some of the issues I raise, but just, yeah, hope this is a helpful beginning. So for the first slide, the next slide, this one, I'd like to just start with definitions to distinguish implementation science from implementation practice. Implementation practice is the use of evidence or interventions, whereas implementation science is the study of the use of evidence and interventions. So there have been a few nuanced ways that the field has defined itself, but essentially implementation science is defined as the study of methods to promote uptake of evidence in a variety of settings. Next slide. So in the context, if you can, so a variety of interventions are going to come up in the context of health equity and disparities in cancer. Coming from the Cancer Institute, there are a variety of evidence-based practices and effective interventions that can improve health outcomes in diverse populations. But these programs are only as useful as they are actually implemented in practice. And there is a substantial service delivery gap that has been documented for these evidence-based practices and effective interventions, such that they aren't necessarily reaching all the populations who could benefit, and particularly vulnerable populations. And although there are platforms for dissemination of these interventions, like the Research Tested Interventions program that NCI hosts, as well as a whole range of others that others host, they are largely only used by researchers. So historically, we recognize researchers often thought that it was not their responsibility to ensure that their research is used, but we now know that the passive process of publishing our findings is not enough. Next slide. And so this slide illustrates that problem. What this slide displays are the findings of a study from 2000 by Andrew Bayless and Sue Boren that asks the question, let's assume that the end product of our research is that high impact publication. What happens next? So what you see in the middle of this slide is the rough publication pathway from publication of our original research to implementation, which they defined as 50% uptake in eligible populations. Sorry, not ready for the punchline yet, but it won't be a surprise to many. On the left side of the slide, you see all the ways we lose valuable evidence, and on the right side of the slide, you see the estimate of how long it takes to get through each and every one of these steps. So the conclusion, which Cassidy just showed you, and we can show you again, is that it takes 17 years for only 14% of original research to benefit patients. So it shouldn't be the case that only 14% of our evidence and that it takes 17 years. And again, that's just the time it takes to reach half of people who could benefit. So in comes implementation science in the next slide, the rationale for our field. It really does go beyond the evidence for effectiveness. Our evidence is only as good as how and whether it is in fact adopted by different systems within different communities. But not just that, but that we also have an effort to identify those practitioners who can then be trained to deliver that intervention. And not just the training, but we have a history of training providers and practitioners where there isn't necessarily a way to come back from that training and incorporate the intervention or practice into their daily routine. So we need to make sure we're also thinking through that integration of what they've learned. And not just that, but also once those trained providers are able to deliver the intervention, that it can also reach all those people who could potentially benefit from it. And even if we get halfway there in each of these steps, even though we know there are all sorts of, and you can fill out the rest of this slide, there are all sorts of issues with access, adherence, dosage, and maintenance. We are down to just a fraction of the benefit that we thought we were going to have with that evidence, with that intervention. And Cassidy, you can advance this slide to show that that fraction of a benefit is just 6% if you measure it that way. So again, we need to make sure that we don't just assume these steps are going to happen by themselves. And putting it another way in the next slide, and this comes from the REAIM framework, which is a very popular framework in this field. It's not just the effectiveness of our evidence and interventions, but these other dimensions that determine the ultimate impact of our work. It's adoption, implementation, maintenance, and reach. And these are some of the objectives of the field of implementation science. So on the next slide, I just want to return to definitions and show how we at the National Cancer Institute use these terms. We see implementation science as bridging the gap between research and practice and policy, and building a knowledge base on how evidence can be most effectively communicated and integrated into practice. So for the purposes of our NIH funding announcements, which I'll show in a few minutes, we break it down into two different components: dissemination research, which is the study of the targeted distribution of information and how best to spread or sustain knowledge and evidence, whereas implementation research is focused on what strategies can best facilitate the adoption and integration of evidence into a given practice. So on the next slide, I tease it out a little bit further for dissemination research. What we're really interested is understanding how, when, by whom, and under what circumstances evidence spreads, and focusing on all the stages of evidence from its creation to its reception. And these are important steps that we often jump over. On the next slide, teasing out a bit further what implementation research is. And this is a dynamic one, Cassidy, so I'll just walk you through the usual. Stop here. In implementation research, we try to draw a contrast from what we typically see in our usual clinical trials, which focus on the what, as seen on the left, all the way to the right, the health outcomes that we are trying to improve. And most trials are predicated on the idea that if we focus on the left and we focus on the right, we'll get the answers that we need. What do we do for this patient and what are the outcomes? But what we jump over is this important middle, which if you move, Cassidy, the slide forward, you can see that's the question of how. So what implementation strategies will support the ability of those interventions to be delivered in a whole variety of settings in which people are seeking care. And importantly, what are the implementation outcomes? So how do we know that those strategies are working to ensure interventions are being delivered? We can see whether those strategies are helping our interventions to be feasible to be delivered, that they are acceptable to populations using them, that they can penetrate as far into the systems and as far into the community so that they reach as many people as possible, and that they are sustained over time and have high rates of uptake, and also making sure that we're understanding costs. So when we start to focus more on the implementation science, what we're ideally seeing beyond the usual is that we can influence implementation outcomes, which would have the knock-on benefit of the service system and population level. So you can advance to the end of the slide and move to the next slide. And on the next slide, I just try to clarify what we mean by implementation strategies. I see we have Prajakta School on the line. This is her slide, and she did a lot of work at NCI helping us translate and think through this. So these are the strategies that we use to ensure or enhance the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of an intervention. So some examples of strategies include things like strategies to educate or train practitioners to effectively adopt and deliver, as well as strategies to ensure practitioners can incorporate those interventions into their workflow or integrate them into their community settings, and evaluative and iterative strategies to ensure implementation fidelity, and where needed, necessary adaptations can be made for a given context, which actually momentarily I'll be arguing that it's always needed, and it's just a matter of ensuring we're measuring that. So how would you select those strategies? It's going to depend on what barriers you are trying to overcome, what resources you are able to leverage in your given context, and who are your stakeholders. So on the next slide, in thinking about those stakeholders, we need to move away from only thinking about that interaction between just the provider and the consumer. We need to consider all the levels in which that relationship exists, which, Cassidy, if you advance, you'll see all those various levels and how those different levels can affect implementation. So when we've historically ignored these levels, we leave out populations who don't have as good access to care, for example. So how do we best get organizational change? How do we best get communities and states to support the implementation of these interventions? So if you click to the next dynamic aspect of this slide, it's particularly important, one more, to engage key stakeholders, and you can keep going, Cassidy, to engage key stakeholders and build the evidence base across all of these levels. And how can implementation science be leveraged in the context of structural level interventions to achieve health equity? Somebody asked this question, so I put it as a note on this slide, and I think, you know, given interest and time, I'm gonna move on, but I think the hope is that this is part of the objective of the field, and I'm glad Prajakta's on so she can answer that question later. So how do we apply this? Implementation science hinges on theories, frameworks, and models to help us understand dissemination and implementation processes. So in the field, we have well over 60 models. Many are borrowed, some are unique to our field. Essentially, the point is you don't have to start from scratch. I'm going to review just a couple examples, starting with this one, which is an adaptation of Everett Rogers' theory on diffusion of innovations, which is one of the oldest theories in the field. And essentially what this slide highlights is that the decision to adopt and the ability to implement effectively is influenced not just by the characteristics of the intervention itself, but also by the organizational characteristics and the context in which that organization exists. So these are important things to consider and measure when trying to figure out how best to implement your intervention. The next framework, next and last framework I wanted to show on the next slide is a very popular framework in implementation science, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which was developed by Laura Damschroeder and colleagues. I mean, as you can see here, they also highlight the importance of thinking about the inner and outer settings. But what they add here is that when thinking about the intervention, you can think about an intervention having both core components and an adaptable periphery. So if you look on the left side of the slide, you see this unadapted intervention that doesn't quite fit within a given setting. But you can go through an iterative process engaging stakeholders at various levels to determine how best to adapt your intervention and identify strategies to enhance its likelihood of reaching the right side of the slide, where you have an intervention with the same core components, but its adaptable periphery now fits well within the setting and is more likely to be adopted, effectively implemented, sustained, and ultimately, hopefully, reaches the populations who can benefit from it. So just a quick word on the next slide about adaptation, which Linda had asked me to add. So implementation science, we really challenge traditional assumptions that evidence and evidence-based practices are static, that systems are static, that implementation proceeds one practice or test at a time, that our consumers and patients and populations and settings are homogeneous. So with a recognition that, and that choosing not to implement is irrational. So we could have a whole conversation on this, but basically the punchline is these are all wrong, and there's clearly a need for adaptation we've observed. These points on voltage drop and program drift, essentially we've observed that when you go from an efficacy trial to an implementation trial, we've seen that there has been this voltage drop in terms of how effective that intervention ends up being when you're actually implementing it in practice. And to address those issues, as well as program drift in terms of this challenge of when you implement it over time. And Rachel, if I'm not mistaken, I think you're going to go into a bit more detail about this, and you've done a lot of work in this area. But essentially addressing sustainability over time. How do we ensure our effective interventions stay effective over time? So there is going to be a need for adaptation. And on the next slide, I just want to mention a resource that has broken down how one way we can think about adaptation, and it's thinking about adapting the intervention, which can be thinking about whether that's cultural adaptations, the mode of delivery adaptations, adapting for a target audience, adapting to a service setting. There have been a variety of other papers that have talked about ways to think about adaptation, but just to give you a sense of this is a really important issue. Which you'll hear more about later. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to just introduce folks who are not already familiar with our one slide before this, is funding opportunities. So these are trans NIH funding opportunities that the National Cancer Institute leads in collaboration with 20 other institute centers and offices from across the NIH. We've funded over 200 grants across the NIH through these mechanisms. It's an R01, an R21, and an R03. I saw a couple people asked about pilot funding and opportunities for funding. So the R21 mechanism is a pilot funding mechanism. R03 is also that exploratory research mechanism to make way for a larger R01 grant. So these, I encourage you to take a look at these funding announcements. Somebody had asked, what are the best institutes for dissemination and implementation grants? And so if you look at these funding announcements, you can see who those 20 institute centers and offices are in addition to the National Cancer Institute. Not all of them are signed on to all three mechanisms. So depending on whether you're applying for pilot funding, pilot study funding, or a larger R01, you can see who participates. But on to the next slide, I just wanted to point out, and I will mention for these funding opportunities, there is a standing study section, the Dissemination and Implementation Research and Health Study section that reviews these grants, so we do have the appropriate expertise. And then just to give you an idea here of a few grants that NCI has funded through these mechanisms, they really span topic areas across the cancer control continuum in a variety of settings. I'm worried about time. I'm going to try to cruise through these. I'd like to encourage everyone to take a look at those funding announcements, but on this next slide, you can just see here questions that we solicit and various aspects of dissemination and implementation processes. So questions around dissemination, research questions on adaptation, a focus on strategies, and not just what works, but how the strategies work. Also a focus on scale up and sustainability. And also something I haven't mentioned yet, but is an area ripe for exploration, is also a recognition that there's lots of things we implement that are not evidence-based, are harmful or wasteful. And so there is an emerging field of de-implementation, and so we encourage additional research in that area as well. So on to the next slide, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that in addition to supporting the advancement of the field of implementation science, another key strategic goal of our team is to think about how implementation science fits within the broader research continuum. And here you can see a traditional translational pathway for intervention, development, testing, and implementation. But let's say you're earlier in this continuum than that purple circle. You could still be thinking about how you design your studies to make it more likely that the ultimate intervention will be implemented. So if you click, Cassidy, to the next, one way you can think about incorporating research aims around implementation within our trials directly. We can be thinking about who will deliver and receive the intervention, and we can be building in tests of those strategies early to see whether they can enable the intervention to be used in practice. So in those earlier stages. So will those strategies enhance the implementation outcomes of adoption, implementation, and sustainment? We can also look at that through hybrid designs, which I'm just going to briefly introduce on the next slide. These are designs on the next slide that Jeff Curran from the VA and other colleagues have laid out a roadmap for how we can incorporate implementation aims into our effectiveness studies. And you can see here, hybrid designs include both research aims about an intervention's effectiveness as well as its implementation. They've laid out different types depending on which aim you're more focused on. And I'm not going to go into that now. But I just wanted to, like I said, a very brief orientation, but I'd like to leave you with, on this next slide, some encouraging news that I hope this was a helpful orientation, and just want to highlight the fact that this year, for fiscal year 21, NCI sees implementation science as a key priority area to advance cancer research and population health. And I know more institutes and centers across the NIH are identifying implementation science as a priority area. So we expect that there will be, and there are plenty of other additional funding opportunities in this area that I did not mention. I just provided you with a trans NIH broad one, but keep an eye here. There will be more coming down the line. And lastly, I just want to end on the next slide that I had mentioned areas ripe for exploration. And on the next slide, you can see in 2019, the NCI launched, here we go, the Implementation Science Consortium to facilitate collaboration and ensure that gaps in our field are addressed. So there were a variety of areas that were focused on in that, including one on health equity, which Prajakta Sewell and Rachel Shelton were the leaders of. So I'm very glad to pass the torch on to Rachel to talk more about her trajectory, and just leaving you with the fact that I come from a large team. Here you can see us. On the next slide, you can also see, if you go to our website, we have a variety of training programs, webinars, and conferences for folks who are asking about ways to be competitive for funding. I'd encourage you to, our training institute is now open access, so anyone can do it, whether you get admitted to the program or not. There's also an implementation science exchange on the next slide. If you're looking for collaborators, this is a great resource out of UNC on the next slide, where you can see examples of funded grants. And there are textbooks in the field that you can also turn to. So with that, I'll pass it on to Rachel. And sorry, I went way over time.
This is wonderful. I'm sure this is so rich with resources and insights. And I think what we'll do is actually go through all the speakers and then come back to questions, just so we make sure we get everything covered. And again, this is the beginning. We can continue doing more in-depth webinars like this as we move forward. So thank you so much. And with that, we'll turn it over to Rachel. And again, thank you all for hanging in there. Zoom is having a little bit of some glitches here, and we're hopefully beyond that at this point. So Rachel, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I will say that somehow my title didn't come out here, but I am going to be focusing on what one example is of developing a research career in implementation science. I do want to say there are many pathways to implementation science. It is a very diverse and large field full of many disciplines. So the example I'm giving you is really from a social and behavioral science perspective in the context of cancer. And I'll also say I'm highlighting a lot of successful grants that I've had, but I do want to say that behind all these successful grants, there are many, many, many rejections, grants that never made it through. So I do want to just acknowledge that that is a normal part of the process. Okay. Oh no. We thought we were over the glitches, but let's see. Okay. So health equity. So a thread of my work over the past 15 years has really focused on equity. So my doctoral training was in social epidemiology, and my dissertation work really focused on this idea that if we want to understand inequities in cancer behaviors and cancer outcomes, we have to consider the larger social context in which it happens. So behaviors do not exist in a vacuum. So I really tried to focus on issues like medical mistrust and experiences of discrimination that have important implications for health equity, as has really been amplified over the past few months. So that has been a common theme that has really motivated and united my work. I wonder if you should take over. For some reason, I'm having the same issue, Cassidy. Why don't you do it? I'm not sure what's going on there. Okay, next slide. So a leader in the field, Larry Green, has this quote that I love, that is, if we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. And this really spoke to me because the other piece of my core training as an MPH student was in community organizing and in community-based participatory research. And to me, that is so essential. Stakeholder engagement is such an essential part of implementation science. So when I learned about this whole idea of practice-based evidence and implementation science, I was very drawn to the field because it had that same essence as I'd been trained in with CBPR. If you go next. Thanks. So this is really what brought me to implementation science. This idea that implementation science focuses on the real world, diverse clinical and community contexts in which we're actually trying to reach populations that would benefit from it most. And this idea that implementation science really has the potential, I think, if leveraged correctly, to address inequities. And I think a lot of us have been doing more work in this area about how we can make that focus on health equity more explicit, because I don't think it's always been there as explicitly as it could be. But these are some of the driving factors that brought me to the field. And Gila did a great job of kind of covering a lot of those definitions and foundations. So then what did I do after my training? So I had my doctorate. I was starting a postdoc at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in Cancer Prevention and Control. And I was really interested in community health worker and lay health advisor programs. And the reason I was interested in those is that they have been well documented to be highly successful in addressing cancer-related inequities, including related to screening. And many of them explicitly focus on addressing issues of stigma or discrimination, which is so important, again, as we said, for health equity. One thing I have learned in the field of implementation science is relationship building is essential, partnership building is essential. And I was very lucky to have a mentor who had been doing work with a group of African-American cancer survivors for the prior 15 or 20 years. And she had developed with them in partnership using CBPR, an evidence-based African-American-led cancer screening program. So I reached out to them. I said, you know what, I would love to partner with you all. When I look at the literature, I feel like we know nothing about you all as implementers and leaders in your communities. And I would love to understand better the impact it's had on you and your larger communities. And they said, that's great, we'd love that. But we're really struggling with sustaining our programs. It was right around 2008, 2010 with the economic downturn, and they had lost so many of their programs nationally. They'd gone from about 40 programs to 20. So they said, let's work on this together as well. So we wrote it was my first grant. It was an R03, and I don't think I even knew about the implementation science study section. So I just submitted to a regular NCI study section. And amazingly, it was funded the first time. I remember my mentor called and she said, just so you know, this never happens. Don't get used to it. And she was right. But I will say that foundational grant, that R03, really allowed us to build this partnership and this implementation science work over the past 10 years. So that was really, really essential, that first NCI grant. If you want to go next. And as Gila said, there is kind of this assumption in implementation science that you're already starting often with some level of evidence, whether it's efficacy or effectiveness. You have some evidence that something works, a program works. But often the research to practice gap that you're trying to address is that it's not being adopted or it's not being implemented. And in this case, it had already been widely disseminated and implemented. It just wasn't being sustained, despite the fact it had been in place for 20 years. So again, this program actually came from NCI's RTIPS program, which is an amazing database of existing evidence-based programs if you're interested. Okay, if you want to go next. Okay, so what did this R03 look like? So you may be familiar or not with the R03. So the R03s are short and not a ton of money. So we couldn't ask these huge big picture questions about sustainability. We started smaller. So we first said, okay, what can we learn about who the implementers are? We know nothing about what they are from the literature. So we did a deep investigation of what are the characteristics, the social, organizational, and individual characteristics of this group, amazing group of women nationally who are serving in these roles. If you want to go next. And these are some of the women who originally started the program. If you want to go next. And then our second R03 question was, okay, we can't look, at long-term sustainability, but they were having huge issues with attrition of lay health advisors. They were losing about 40% per year. So we said, let's look at short-term, what quantitatively through surveys, let's measure all these individual social and organizational factors and see which ones actually predict whether or not they stay in the program. So this was published in Implementation Science, if you want to look at that. If you want to move to the next slide. And we formed kind of based on our qualitative and quantitative kind of a roadmap of what we were measuring. And what we found is that those organizational factors really mattered for retention in the program. If you want to go next. Our third question, so context is really critical, as Gila said, in implementation science. So we learned that organizational factors mattered, but that didn't really mean much from a survey perspective. We didn't know who the program champions were. We didn't know what organizational stability looked like. We didn't know what resources were being exchanged through partnerships. So we did an in-depth qualitative investigation at the same time to better understand this policy and organizational context where implementation was happening. If you want to go next, and next. Okay, and so as part of this qualitative investigation, we actually took both our survey findings and our interviews, and we came up with what we called the LHA sustainability frameworks of factors that we learned from that R03 seem to matter for ongoing participation of the lay health advisors, and that we also learned might matter for larger program sustainability. So we published this. If you want to go next. And that was kind of 2010 to 2013. And this next phase was really critical. During the same time period, 2013 to 2018, after that R03, I applied for the TITRE training, which people may be familiar with through NIH. And this also allowed me to go deeper in implementation science in terms of my own training, but most importantly, really allowed me to develop a peer network of other implementation scientists, which has been critical, and also a mentor network of national leaders in the field. I also developed a course in implementation science. And I always say, if you really want to learn something, develop and teach a class on it, because you have to get really clear on the material. So that allowed me to do a really deep dive, and I had to really know what I was talking about. So I've developed and taught that over the last 6 or 7 years. And then thank you, ACS, American Cancer Society. They also awarded me at the same time a Mentored Research Scholar Award, which gave me 5 years of coverage for my salary and training to further support me in this area. So this was really critical in allowing me to develop further in this area. If you want to advance. And I'll just say, I also highly recommend pilot awards. So at our university, we have small pots of money from our provost where we can also explore new areas we're learning from our research. So I also started to explore issues of de-implementation, which Gila spoke about. As I started understanding issues of sustainability with this lay health advisor program, if you go to the next slide, I also started to recognize that the screening guidelines had changed multiple times over the past 25 years. And so I've started to dig deeper into whether or not the programs were actually remaining evidence-based and the challenges to do so. If you go next. And then from that, and based on my experience at TITRE, I put in a research scholar grant from the American Cancer Society, which was funded. And we're now in our second year of that. So again, both the RO3 and the career development really laid the foundation for that larger grant. If you go next. Okay. And one thing I'll just end with is often we're focusing on real world applied, trying to address a specific research to practice gap. Another area you might want to think about is in the field of implementation science, people also try and advance specific areas within implementation science. So what I have done over the past 5 to 7 years is focus a lot of my time and publications specifically on sustainability as a specific domain within the field. If you go next, you can go quickly through these. So here's just an example from Annual Reviews of Public Health and AJPH. If you go next and next and next. And what I really did was try to build some expertise and knowledge around that, and then have partnered with people globally and nationally in specific settings to understand what sustainability might look like. Okay, go next. You can go next. Great. And then lastly, I'll just end. So really in the last couple of years, I kind of transitioned from being a trainee in some of the tighter programs to being a faculty member. And now at Coumbia, actually leading an implementation science initiative through our CTSA. And I have to say that that whole process now of being a faculty and getting to weigh in on grants has been such an amazing opportunity and learning opportunity for me as well, kind of moving forward in the field. So again, this is a lot of information. I've put a lot of resources. If you go forward a couple slides. Keep going, keep going. Here are some that Gila mentioned, and if you go one more further, there are some amazing resources. I highly recommend University of Washington's Implementation Science resource. It really pulls together a lot of the key trainings, a lot of the grant opportunities, and training opportunities you'll have in career development as well. So thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Shawna.
Thank you, Rachel. That was excellent. We both have gone through so much information in a short period of time, and so I think there's a lot to dig in here afterwards. So Shawna, can we turn it back over to you?
That sounds good. So Kennedy, I think I'm going to let you, or Cassidy, I'm going to let you drive on this. So we're going to go quickly through my slides. So next slide. So just by way of sort of background here, I'm actually, I think Linda introduced me earlier, I'm a medical sociologist by training and do most of my research in mixed methods. I was a reviewer, a standing committee member for the Dissemination, Implementation, Research and Health Study section for 4 years and ad hoc for a year before that. So I have a lot of experience reading through a lot of these grants, and as well have been on the PCORI DNI Study section and a few other study sections, and also am engaged with our CTSA here around the DNI initiatives. So probably also of interest to a lot of people in the audience, I was a KO1, so as Linda mentioned, I've been with GMaP since the beginning, and I began as a trainee, as a CURE trainee in the KO1 program, and now am currently, I guess, a seasoned investigator. So a lot of my work is in the cancer survivorship area, prevention and control, and focused on vulnerable populations. So next slide. Cassidy. Okay, so the nice thing about going after both Rachel and Gila is that I'm going to fly through the next 5 or 6 slides, because the first thing that I want everybody to think about, and so I'm giving you my perspectives as a reviewer and sort of thinking about what mechanism, how do you figure out which mechanism that you want to do the work and how do you situate your work, there are a series of 3 questions that or 3 topic areas that I'm going to take you through today in my discussion. So the first one is knowing your science, and Rachel and her slides before focused in on this book. Also, Gila mentioned it as well. One of the things that you really want to get clear on is, are you doing dissemination science? Are you doing implementation science? Or are you doing some sort of combination? So you really want to know what your science is and sort of how does it fit. And so I'm going to skip through the next couple of things. So as we saw before, Gila went through the definitions of DNI, and so I'm not going to go through those. The other piece, and let's stick on this slide for a minute, that I think is important to think about is, you'll notice at the bottom of this slide, we all are talking about the program announcement for dissemination, implementation, research in health. And that particular program announcement, I think, is really helpful for anybody who wants to do research in this area, regardless of whether or not you're responding to those mechanisms, or if you're at the level where you're looking at something that's more like a career development award, so a K99 or R00. And the reason I say that it's helpful is because there's a lot of information in the program announcement that talks about what is DNI research, what are reviewers in particular trained to look for in terms of DNI research. And one of the main areas, and this language is pulled directly from that program and from those program announcements, it really focuses in on 3 areas that you need to be thinking about as you're sort of putting together DNI research. So one is there a team science approach? So it's not enough to be sort of the lone ranger with DNI studies. You really want to have a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary group that you're working with. Much of our work, as Gila mentioned earlier, is theory driven and process theory driven. So she went through a number of mechanisms or frameworks that are currently in the field. And so you want to become familiar with those. And then the third area that Rachel talked a bit about is being stakeholder engaged. So whether you're doing sort of a full participatory action model, such as witness, or if you're doing something that's more sort of stakeholder engaged and looking at health systems and looking at the different stakeholders there, those are sort of 3 major components that reviewers are looking for within your science to see sort of, are you looking at the science and the work through a DNI lens? So let's skip to the next one. Actually, you can skip to the next one after this. So the first thing is knowing your science and knowing where you sort of fall into the DNI science piece. The other area that you want to be thinking about in terms of your work is, are you proposing to do DNI research, or is your focus, and this could be an either or an and in this case, is your focus going to be trying to contribute to the DNI science? And the reason I bring this up as an issue, next slide, is because, as Gila mentioned earlier, there is the science of dissemination and implementation, and then there's sort of the process of doing DNI work. And this particular article from Paul Estabrooks and Ross Bronson and Nicholas Pronk, I think, is a really nice introduction for those who are trying to sort of get your feet grounded and wet in understanding sort of what are the differences, what is the history behind the science, and sort of how do we move forward. It really articulates nicely the science and the approach, and really a focus, I think, that is unique to DNI science is really around sort of systems-based approaches. So understanding sort of how do different systems in different contexts sort of lend themselves, and what are the process models that we need to be thinking about to better understand how our science gets implemented, and what are we actually doing, and how does that impact the health outcomes that we're looking at. So if you move to the next slide, what I'm going to spend the rest of my time sort of going through very quickly is sort of 3 different pathways that I've seen available to you as sort of a burgeoning DNI researcher. And so I'm going to go through the first one. Let's go to the next slide. So there's 3 different things that you could be doing. as a DNI person and a person who wants to do DNI research. So one is you can choose a program announcement that specifies a need for DNI or has an interest in DNI. And there are a number of different announcements out there. So I'm going to go very quickly through one that our group applied to and has funding through. Go back, sorry, Cassidy. The second thing I'm going to do is talk about, are you using DNI methods? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the DIRH study section and the two pathways through that particular mechanism, either in response to the program announcement or using that study section to review the science, but not in response to the program announcement. So next slide. So this one I'm going to go through really quickly, but one option is, as I mentioned before, you can look for a program announcement that has a DNI interest. So I currently have an R01 that's funded in tobacco policy that's looking at Tobacco 21, and it's an MPI program with Chris Del Nevo. So if you skip to the next slide, this one. And so it is actually focused around looking at the implementation of Tobacco 21, and we're doing sort of case studies across the states. And I'm not going to get into the details of this, but one of the things I wanted to sort of pick out for you is that we use the REAIM implementation project, and as well we use multiple streams from the political science area as sort of a theoretical framing for it. And it was in response to a program announcement that looked for implementation science, but was not particularly, we did not tailor this to say we were going to move forward the science of implementation science. So one way of doing implementation science work is that you can find an announcement, find a call that is looking for these approaches, but not necessarily saying, okay, you're going to contribute to the science. Next slide. So option 2 is that you can actually go to the DNI study section, so DIRH, and this is the link to that study section. You have a couple of different options for review. So there's DIRH, which we've talked a lot about, but if you go to the next slide, there are also other study sections where they will pull in reviewers who have the appropriate methodology and expertise. So if your work is focused around health disparities and equity, focused at the community level, nursing science, and also health services and delivery. I actually was just a reviewer for that study section. There are a number of different study sections that will bring in expertise for DNI research. And so that's a potential possibility. So let's go to the next one. So I'm going to skip this slide because that's a study that we have currently and go to this third one. So the third one is that you can respond to the program announcement. And so Gila has talked a lot, has shown a lot of slides about that. And one of the things that I think is really important to know about that program announcement is that it's not just that you're using the approaches of DNI science to answer a question, but you actually are part of the review criteria in the program announcement, and also what the reviewers are going to be looking for is, are you contributing to the DNI science, and what are the ways in which your science is set up to leverage that? So if you move to the next slide, you can see in these three things, three of the main areas that they will look for in terms of the significance is, how is this going to actually contribute to DNI knowledge that would be advanced? In innovation, they're looking for novel methods and findings. And then also in the investigative team, part of the review criteria is there clear evidence of DNI research expertise on the team? So if you're going to go for that program announcement, you need to also be very mindful that there is an additional bar that's there that is, in addition to the program announcement, you're really going to be wanting to contribute and be able to demonstrate that you're contributing to the science. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to skip this part. It's in the program announcement. You can read that. We have a study that just completed, which was a 3-year observational study of primary care practices. That's an R01 that I was a co-investigator on. And one of the things that I want to note about this is, if you move to the next slide, And again, you'll have access to these. You can take a look at them. If you go into NIH Reporter, you can take a look under the results for every single application. You can see which studies and which papers have actually been published around the science of individual grants. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight with this particular study was that not only were we interested in, you know, looking at the scientific question here, but we also use this as an opportunity to do some critiques around implementation science. So we have a paper that was in the Annals of Family Medicine that just recently came out that's about shifting implementation science theory to empower primary care practices. So again, one of the things you want to be thinking about if you decide to use the DNI program announcement is, are there places in your science where you're not only going to find the answers to your scientific question, but also engage with the broader literature? And so you want to make sure that if you're going to go with that announcement, that you're going to set yourself up to be poised to be able to be competitive in that way. So if you move to the next one, so this is my closing slide. So the main things that, you know, I would say you want to think about it from a review perspective is know your science, what is it, and how do you want to put it out there for the reviewers. Know the scope. So are you contributing, are you proposing DNI research? Are you proposing to contribute to the science, and what's that distinction? And then once you make those decisions, then think about clearly what's your pathway. So is it something where it's a content focus and you're using DNI as a way to better understand the issue? Or are you really sort of looking at DNI and the science sort of hand in hand, and that may make you decide to go towards the program announcements? So with that, I'm going to stop, and we're at 4:01. So
Wow. Shawna, thank you so much. I mean, that was excellent as well. And I think kind of giving people to really kind of start thinking about this broadly, that yes, there is implementation science research that might be responsive to specific PARs, but implementation science isn't only fit there. And it's I think you're all talking about how do we think about applying it both to practice, to other kinds of research. I think going back to Gila's point of, you know, even designing for dissemination from the beginning, and maybe taking some of these principles and thinking about what that intervention you're developing looks like, that's really going to even be feasible to be implemented in sort of real practice. So I think given time, I'm going to kind of remind everybody that we will be sending out a survey, and please give us some feedback on the evaluation about this webinar and other topics you're looking for. That will be coming, and so please look for that. If you have questions specifically about GMaP for Region 4, you can reach out to Carrie Norbeck. If you're in another region, please reach out to your coordinator, and you can find that on the NCI website. And I don't know if Rachel, Shawna, or Gila, you have like one word you'd like, or one kind of sort of highlight you'd like to leave with everyone. I think the challenge of questions with time, I don't want to keep people too long. As we've put in the chat, please put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to kind of pull some information to answer them and send them back out. But this has been an incredible webinar. Rachel, Shawna, Gila, any last words of advice to our early stage investigators?
The only thing I said was take advantage of your program officers, and I did put that in the chat, that you should, as you're developing your concepts, whether it's for a K or for an R, for a research grant, reach out to your program officers, and they're happy to provide guidance. That's our job.
Great.
I'd also say that if your intervention isn't quite ready in terms of some level of effectiveness, it's probably not ready for the DRRH study section, but you might think about, like I did, embedding questions and using other mechanisms, or, you know, trying to understand context to inform some of that larger work. So it's really useful to kind of map out, where does implementation fall if my intervention's not quite there yet? And in a couple of years, what might this look like? I think that's the biggest challenge sometimes people face is, does this fit in DRH? Does it advance the science? And if it doesn't, don't give up. But it might take a couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's actually really great advice. And the other thing that I would add is also take advantage of the expertise both within the GMAPs. So there's GMAP 4, which is this particular group, but all of them, there are DNI researchers across the country, and many of us are affiliated with our cancer centers in addition to the CTSAs. And so there are ways to network to us either through the conference, and so going to get exposed and finding opportunities there, or networking sort of locally through your cancer center and through your CTSAs.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if you can't give a hand because you're muted, but I hope you will all thank this incredible group, Gila, Shawna, Rachel. Thank you so much from Region 4 and all the other GMAP regions for this incredible webinar today. We will be posting it, so you can come back and check into things maybe you missed or you want to dive in a little deeper, and wish everybody well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.